blessing. So you'll stand and we'll bow our heads and ask God's blessing. Father in heaven, we come before you now and thank you for this wonderful opportunity for a Sabbath seminar and classes about the ABC, or not ABC, about the United States and British Commonwealth and prophecies that pertain to this nation and others. We pray for your guidance and inspiration on this final presentation in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Okay. This is what I taught at ABC, so that's why it's got the label on it the last time that I gave it there. It is, and I might speak to that for just a minute, of course, with the Ambassador Bible Center or Bible College now. We had usually 18-year-olds up to always, hopefully, a handful or at least part of a handful of older folks that were there to add some wisdom to the class. Except when Eric was there, he brought wisdom. But this was new knowledge to most of our younger folks. They don't know this. We have a United States and Britain in Prophecy book, booklet, which is pretty good. I got help with some of the research on it back in the day when we put it together, but it doesn't have the commanding tone that Mr. Armstrong gave to the original one. He had the energy behind it, and he wrote that energy in. None of us have ever been able to match that. But we had a few things that we added in that weren't they were known, but they weren't widely known at all at that time. And when Mr. Armstrong wrote the original one, that added some essence to it, and I'll cover some of those, some of the extra background and history that just adds more impact. You know, if you're going to get run over, you could be run over by, what's the dinkiest little car you can think of?
Smart car.
The which?
Smart car.
A smart car, yeah. You can get run over by a smart car, or you can get run over by a truck. 18 wheels that don't speak smart. So we want to have the impact of the added things that bring us along in understanding this. I've covered some of these in our presentation so far today. Superstructure of history is the Bible, a little bit of Israelite history, which most of us know, so I didn't cover that here. Self-evident prophecies, some of the obvious ones, which we have covered in the course of the day. National names. I need to mention that. It'll come up in just a little bit. You can see Hebrew, and I told you about Eber. Excuse me. Something in the back of my throat. So from Hebrew we get Eber or Iber, which is be pronounced Eber by most people. That where an I starts, we always make a long I out of a word that starts with an I, but not all nationalities do. They often make that I that sound like a little I, an E. Now Omri. Omri is important. Omri was the king of the house of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, in the late 800s BC. You probably don't remember Omri. Many people in the ancient world did. But what you remember was his son, because of his evil wife. And so what was his son's name? Ahab, yes. And not Ahab the Arab, as that song went. It was Ahab the Israelite. He married Jezebel. So Omri was the father of Ahab. However, it was when Omri was king that the Assyrian Empire came in contact started trading with the Israelites. So they never called them Israel, except on very rare occasions. Actually, one inscription they did. Typically, Israel was the land of the house of Omri. Omri was the first one they had official, sort of state-to-state relations. So they remembered Omri's name. And roughly in the Assyrian tongue of the old was Mat Bit Komri. They didn't do the aw sound for Omri. They had a guttural G-ish sound. G-ish, actually G-H is usually how it's written. Mat Bit Gomri. So Gomri and the G, K sounding. And by the way, phonetics is important in tracking the tribes because you track names from one language to another. And you listen to the sound and how did they hear the sound. So Omri was very important from that perspective, is the Assyrians called him Gomri, Matbit Gomri, which got broken down with another E sound, Matbit Gomri. They would toss in the extra syllables that sometimes happens. Gomri, they became known as the G, became a K, because phonetically G and K are all made back in the back of the throat, and people who read lips have a terrible time identifying G and K. So Matbit Gomri became Komri, and then Kimiri. Vowels morph too. Kimirians. So the Kimirians were Israelites. The reason that's important, because you'll see them in historical atlases. The Kimirians were here, the Kimirians were there. They were part of the Israelites that were still carrying the remnant of the Assyrian word for Omri. Matbit Gomri became Kimirian. Isaac, important to understand, in Hebrew, vowels don't exist. You just have consonants. So Isaac has got S and C, but it's a K-sounding C, not a soft C. So it's Sak. And if you do an I sound, it's Itzak. In Hebrew, the Isaac would be more like an Itzak. But whoops, how did I do that? I'll come back to... There, all right. So Itzak. So Isaac and Omri and Eber are three national names that are really important to follow through the maps, the historical maps. Then you get an idea, because most of the people with those names are going to be Israelites. On occasion it's somebody else, but most of the time it's them. Archaeology is another thing that I'll touch on that a little bit as we go. Tribal and clan names came after that. The tribal names of the clans were the names of the sons of the clan leader. And whatever their sons' names were became the name for that clan. And the clan, sometimes you can tell which tribe it is based on the sound of the clan names. And then you will find those clan names showing back up again, where they were taken captive, and then in various places as they migrate northwest. And the reason that we can know they migrate northwest is because of Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 12. I don't think it's on this presentation, but chapter 49 and verse 12 is a messianic prophecy, the time that the Israelites are coming back to Jerusalem. And here they come from they come from the north and the west. That meant they're coming from there, they went there. In other words, if you drew a line from Jerusalem to London, that was the direction that they went. And then it refers to some from the south. And that would, of course, mean South Africa had some Israelites in it, Australia, New Zealand. So you find some of them scattered to the south as well, but most of the migrations were from the north and west. All right, now, so we're going to look at the blessings of blessed places and things. The God of your Father who will help you, and the Almighty God who will bless you with the blessings of heaven above, the blessings of the deep that lies beneath, the blessings of the breast of the womb, and they'll be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who is separate from his brothers. So Joseph will get the lion's share of the blessings. Therefore, we expect to see that in the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh because of this prophecy. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier today, but to summarize real quickly, the British Empire controlled 25% of the land surface by 1939. They were at their apex of size. Of course, World War II, they began to shrink the empire. The vast natural resources of America were part of that. The gates of their enemies, mountain passes like the Khyber Pass north in Pakistan or India or wherever that exactly is. I don't know who owns the territory at the moment. The sea, there were straits, there were strategic islands, Guam, The Hawaiian Islands for America are sea gates. The Falkland Islands, down off of Argentina, that's a sea gate. And you think, what do you mean it's a sea gate? It's off the side of Argentina. It commands the Cape of Good Hope. Because they all have to go past the Falklands to get out or to go in. That's why it was a sea gate. Part of the reason why Margaret Thatcher fought a war over it, because it was a strategic spot for Great Britain. Air and space, we got military bases, of course. America scattered their strategic air command all around the world, strategically placed to hem in the Soviets after World War II. We don't know of all the places. Unless you had clearance, you wouldn't have heard, but they were there, and so enough of it's, when it's declassified, we come out, we find out about it. Satellites in the air, eye in the sky. That's a gate. Monitoring communication, monitoring movements. And that was with your basic satellites that we originally had. Now we have satellites that do a lot more than that. They can read what your card is in your pinochle hand if you're outside playing pinochle, so don't go outside to play pinochle. There was the British Empire. Now, if you were to color the United States blue and Alaska blue, let's see, 1920s, and you'd have to color the Philippines blue too, because that was part of our territory at the time, America's territory before we gave them their independence because we didn't really want to keep the Philippines. We just wanted to help them. A gigantic place like Soviet Union is a huge place. And yet, America and Britain had command of the 20th century. To a certain degree, we still do. Weakened in certain ways, strengthened in other ways technologically. Legends and traditions is another aspect of understanding the tribes of Israel. Legends and traditions. We covered this today. The tribe of Dan sailed to Greece before the Exodus, became the Spartans and Trojans, descendants of the Danoi or the Danaan. Either way, Danoi and Danaan were just variations of the same word. The Greeks, with quotes, colonized the Black Sea during the Judges in the 1200s BC. And we'll show you some maps that explain that. To tell you, though, the key, though, if you go to the Black Sea and you get a map, you can go on Google or wherever, you can find a good map, where they tell you the names of the rivers on the Black Sea. You know that if you go up the western side, the really big one on the Black Sea is the Danube. And it's usually not blue, but it is the Danube. And if you continue on, you'll go to the Dnieper, and then the Dniester, D-N-Iper, D-N-Eister, that's Dan at the front. Then you've got the Don River, and one of the feeding rivers into the Don or the Dnieper, one or the other, is the Donay. You've got dams everywhere. I have a map that will probably show that. I think that's in this one. But all of the rivers, virtually all the rivers feeding into the Black Sea are Dan rivers. They're named by the tribe of Dan, and the name stuck all this time. The Trojan descendant of Brutus, I didn't even get into this with what we were talking about this morning. When the Battle of Troy was over, Brutus was a grandson of the king of Troy. And he started his migration. He ended up in London. And he founded London. And he is considered the first British monarch. When you look at the royal line and how they calculate their monarchs, Brutus was the first king of Britain. Well, if he's the first king of Britain, then he had to be of the appropriate tribe and the appropriate line of the appropriate tribe. Tribe of Judah, of the line of, let me see, if he was going back that far, that would have been probably the line of the Trojans. So he was coming along on the tribe of Zerah Judah instead of Pharez. The tribe of Asher. At least we think that Odin was of the tribe of Asher. Odin migrated with his people. They lived in Sar, which was on the Don River, north of the Black Sea. The people were called the Asiamen, Asa, the Asir. That's why we think it was probably Asher. Although Odin was a priest king, chances are he was a Levite to be a priest king. That would be the largest guess. He was from Asgard on the River Don. If this sounds like the movie Thor and the retelling of those legends, that's where the legends came from. This is the Viking Valhalla of the Vikings. Their founding heroes became their gods for paganism. Man worships men instead of worshiping the true God. He moved his people from Asgard to Scandinavia, and he settled on the island initially that is just off the coast of Sweden, which is called Gotland. Gothland. And Gotland Goth is another term that we would recognize to be a Hebrew derivative, and one of the elements of the tribes of Israel. Later, he moved on into what would be southern Sweden, and then that became known as Gothland. And Sweden is the capital of Sweden, or at least the regional capital down in that part of the country, is Gothenburg. Batman used to live there. No, I'm kidding about that. But it is Gothenburg, or based on the name for the Goths. So you got Gothland. His sons were Vegdeg and Beldeg. Vegdeg and Beldeg are supposed to have founded Britain, probably the Celtic element of Britain. And so they were worshipped by the British Celts as gods, just like the Scandinavians worshipped their own Valhalla of gods. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles traces the Anglo-Saxon genealogy to Woden. See, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, isn't that what was written by the Venerable Bede? I think in the 6 or the 800s AD. He was a priest, so it had to be after the 600s. That wrote the ancient history of Britain, which is still used as a reference because he was closer to the ancient history than we are. But it was the genealogy of Woden, which is another way of saying Odin. And we know the name Woden because we celebrate it the middle of every week. Woden's Day, Wednesday. Run Woden together, you got Wednesday. And we honor Odin's wife. Isn't this nice? The day before the Sabbath. Yeah. Frey was his wife's name. Friday is Friday. Monday is Moon Day. Sunday is Sunday. Tuesday is, who is Tues? Thursday, we got Thursday. So you see where we get our names for the days of the week in English? Straight out of Israelite paganism. Isn't that lovely? Art history. Now this is interesting and important because historians that are doing research and trying to figure out who people are they'll go directly to the art is one of the key things because cultures will have common art. And if you were to travel extensively and you come back to America and you go, oh, this looks like home because our art is American. And you get to know other cultures, other language cultures, you notice that they have a distinctive style of art. You know, the Dutch masters and the way they painted their pictures. It was pictures of what Holland looked like and still, to a certain degree, looks like. So the studying of art is a very useful tool in tracking people through history. The Scythians are noted for their vigorous art style, which was one of the formative influences in development of Celtic art in Europe. So here we have in that statement, the Scythian art and the Celtic art are related. The only way they could be related if they were a common people, because art is an expression of a culture. So they had to have the cultural commonalities to end up having art that is so remarkably similar. Scythian burial mounds, like those found in the mounds of Pazrik. Where's Pazrik? Is that Russia? It's in eastern Russia, western Russia, over toward Europe. Obviously, I've read the next word. Are very elaborate. Very elaborate, and they contain many artifacts decorated with, note this, fantastic animal motifs. Scythian art did. Now let's look at a little bit of that. There is a fantastic Scythian motif. It's a battle. The Scythians, we'll get to where they came from, but when Israel went in to captivity, some of them went into captivity because Assyria was on the west side of the Caspian Sea. So they took the initial bunch of the 10 tribes there. But some of them were deployed because they immediately put them in the territories, on the buffer territories between themselves and their enemies. There was a kingdom to the north called Urartu. So a line of them were put there. Those were mostly Cimmerians. And then the Scythians were deployed more over toward the Caspian Sea, but still north of Nineveh, being the capital of Assyria. But they also put some of the later captivity down in the cities of the Medes. And that's what it says there when they deployed their captives. The Medes had a captivity or a territory that stretched around the bottom of the Caspian Sea and extended out into Bactria, is what they call it now. It would be northern Iraq and Iran. So they were put there as buffers. Now it's interesting, the thinking of the Assyrians. You have this enemy that you conquered. They really don't like you anymore. You have destroyed their cities. You killed a lot of their friends, and you drag them away to be slaves to you. And then you put them out in this territory outside of your immediate supervision, and because you want them to be the first thing that the enemy hits when they come in, you arm them. You armed Israelites who you made mad before you armed them, and you turned your back? That's not smart. So as you can imagine, the Scythians developed their classic style. It would be similar to the Scythians that went up between the Black and Caspian Seas in the days of Peter and Andrew. That was their pastorate. Peter was on the southern tier of territory below the Black Sea, right on the coast. Andrew's territory was Scythia, which meant he went up between the two, Caspian and Black Seas, and up and above that. It was all known as Scythia. It would basically be Russia, part of Russia today, but that was Scythia then. And then the Scythians became very powerful with their weapons. You'll note them that typically when their hats were still on their heads, he lost his, they have these pointed hats that they wore. So this is a Scythian fighting a Scythian. See the pointed hat? They wore trousers and boots. Always had trousers and boots and hats. Does that sound familiar when you get to America? And they liked horses a lot. They really liked horses. And they were incredibly good with gold. And if you notice these creatures, those are lions. Fantastic animal motifs. Here you have an action figure, a dead horse, a live horse, 3 live soldiers fighting each other, and then you have a bunch of lions that are down underneath. It's a comb for holding your hair in place. It's sort of combing it out, but mainly to hold a lot of it in place. It was about like that wide and yay high. Very tiny art, but very remarkable art. In fact, from the area of Greece, talking about tiny art, we have an article at home we pulled off the internet from one of the art science magazines, and it is a picture that is about that big, smaller than a quarter, but they have it blown up to about that big, and it shows they're Celtic fighters based on the tartans that 2 of them are wearing as a loincloth, and one has a sword, and he's been stabbed and is falling on the ground, and the other one, who is fighting both of the other 2, he's about to stab the third one with a sword. He's coming down like that with his sword past the guy's shield. A very dynamic picture and tragic destruction in a war scene. But it's that big. And what amazes the researchers, they're dumbfounded, because as they study this in a microscope, they find that the strokes of making that picture are 0.5 millimeter long. 0.5 millimeter long. How did you do that? Before, you had magnifying glasses and microscopes that would be needed to do that today. They had to have magnifying glasses. They had to have something to expand that, to do that. Therefore, there was more technology than what the evolutionary scientists think, or evolutionary historians think. They think the ancients dragged their knuckles on the ground, and that's why they are so amazed when they see stuff like this dating so far back. They don't give God the glory, so they don't have any thinking of God in their background. The dating of Scythian art, it coincides with the Assyrian invasions in the early 700s BC. This is when they date the Scythian art, early 700s, and going forward from there, or going downward toward zero from there. So you will find it in Syria, in Phoenicia, and northern Israel. And it's the same style of art found there that they then find elsewhere. It is called Neo-Assyrian art, also called Phoenician art, and it is remarkably similar to the Celtic art. This is a Celtic piece. You have warriors and marching along with various weapons, and I don't exactly know what that one is on, but it's a decoration on something, typically is what it was. These were the characteristics of both Scythian and Celtic art, showing a relationship between the Celts and the Scyths. Zoomorphic structure. That means animals, animal structure, animal shapes and things. Inversion, bending part of the animal's body, this way or that way, like those lions all crouched down. Animal arrangement in a form of a cross or a swirl of some kind. This is before the cross was viewed like it is viewed by the Roman Church today. The recumbent posture, animals leaning back, is typical. The lotus or the palmetto motif, which actually were part of Israel's culture of having the plants. Their art included a lot of lions, a lot of deer, a lot of roosters, and a lot of raptors, or hawks. And then composite scriptures that were part of several of these. You know, it got lion claws and a hawk's nose or face and beak and wings and a tail like a horse. You know, they mix them all together. This is a torque. The torque would be worn around the neck to hold a cloak. And so that's what they were used for. This is a Celtic one here, and that's a Scythian one there. What you can't see really well there and over here is there's a horse and a rider. Tiny little horse and a tiny little rider. When we look at the torque here, again, it's a similar style, but they used the lions in a recumbent posture on the ends of the ring that they would have their cloak tied to around their neck. That's just an example of many examples. Probably the finest collection of Scythian art is used to be Petrograd, St. Petersburg in Russia, because the Scythians were in Russia for a long time, and during the Soviet days, the Russians dug them up. And we didn't have any access to those until after the Soviet Union fell, and then we got more access to looking at them. This is Celtic 200s BC. It's an eagle on a helmet. Again, this is a Scythian plaque. This one, I think, was found on the edges of a bridle, right at the ends of the bit, to decorate it on the horse's bridle. Now here, this is the Book of Kells, a Celtic book. And notice how it's decorated. They chose cats. And if you look at them, obviously here's a cat's face. And you think, whoops, there's a cat face there. Looks like Catman to me. Oh, there are two eyes. That's got to be a cat's face there. And then there's one down here. Oh, whoops, there's another one there. And they would weave these things in. That's just the first letter at the beginning of the book. And the whole book is illustrated like that on the sides of every page. Now, the other one is Scythian art. Again, odd structure for animals, kind of like a stag lying down. He's got his head back against as far back as he can get his antlers down, kind of trying to be out of sight. But that was the style of art that they like to have. Linguistics, this is very interesting. When connecting who the tribes of Israel are, the study of linguistics. British historian Sharon Turner, that's a guy, by the way, Sharon was a man's name in those days, 1827. The most important fact this most important fact of a great part of Armenia having been called Sakasina. The Saka, that's the Isaac name. Sakasina is mentioned by Strabo, that other Greek historian we talked about earlier, in another place, and seems to give a geographical locality to our primeval ancestors. They were Scythians. The British understand that. As they must have come into Armenia from the northern regions of Persia. So they're migrating out of Persia into Armenia, and then they'll eventually go up between the Black and Caspian Sea and over into Europe. Now, Turner did language comparisons. And he said that the English language is the Scythian language. It's derived from the Scythian language. Terry Blodgett, professor at Southern Utah University, in 1981 wrote a book called The Phonological Similarities of Germanic and Hebrew. His findings are that 1/3 of the underlying structure of the Germanic languages is derived from Hebrew. I mean, really? 1/3 of our words are Hebrew words in English? It's very interesting. Here's an example. In Hebrew, we have bash, ba'ash. In English, it's bashful, or shy, abash, or to be abashed. Rab, rabble. Safar, cipher. What is ciphering? We don't do ciphers. We have calculators that do ciphers, adding stuff up. Tsur. Oh, I got a tsur on my hand. It's sore. It's the same word. You just understand how you run the T and the S together, you get sore. Shaber. Oh, it's cold. I feel like shaver. Shiver. Or shiver. The shiver, I think I left a V out of that, didn't I? Does anybody have a spell check in their head? Anyway, shiver, it's shiver both directions. And if you're sick, you puke. But if you're Hebrew, you pook. Same word. You cook your steak too long on the charcoal, and it's going to be charred. It's going to be chara. It's the same word, basically. If you can't hear, you're dumb. We used to say deaf and, sorry, not deaf, you can't speak, you're dumb. Well, dumb in their language is dumb. Same word. Earth is eretz. All you need is an H and get the th sound to be the way we say it in English. So you can see the words are closely related. Blodgett's work is very extensive in laying the groundwork that proves that English is derived from Hebrew. Well, if English is derived from it, so are some other Northwest European languages. Because up to 500 AD, they all spoke the same language in Northwest Europe. Then, in 500 AD, the Saxons were going into England. The Franks were consolidating their holdings in France, and the others in the Scandinavian countries and down in Holland, and they began to develop then their own dialects, which became their own languages. But they all came from the same root language, and that shows that it was connected to Hebrew, which then shows us the 10 tribes, which were Hebrew and spoke Hebrew. Now they were changing their names and their national identities, but they were all the same people at one time. Historical maps is another way we look at it. This is a picture of, I don't know if it was a self-portrait or if somebody else did it, Claudius Ptolemaeus in Alexandria, Egypt, 2nd century Roman geographer, one of the most famous. He was called the geographer. I think he sort of put the word together. He was, interestingly, a round earther long before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In fact, most everybody was a round earther. It was the Roman Church that believed the earth was flat. And they told people that, I think, to keep them in Europe so they wouldn't be afraid of sailing off the edge. Who knows why exactly, but that's a good guess, I suppose. Geography, his geography work came in 8 volumes. Alexandria, Egypt was one of the great centers of learning in those days till the library was burned down and then it wasn't so good. he had access to far more ancient sources than 2nd century AD. So we'll just look at a few of his maps and you can see the detail. You look at this one, there's Spain, this is Africa, there's the Red Sea, that's the Gulf of Suez, and there's the Gulf of Aqaba, this is Saudi Arabia, Holy Land or Israel is right there. There's Asia Minor, there's Greece, there's Italy, and the rest of Europe there, and off into Scythia land and so on. But obviously he was looking at it as a round earth. He wasn't drawing it as a flat earth. He's drawing it as a round one. There's another version of looking at it. It's a little out of proportion over here, but with no satellite pictures to operate from. That's pretty good, you know? I'm not sure what Groenland is. I'd have to look that one up. But we've got the British Isles, Ireland and England, Spain again, Gaul or France as it was called, and the rest of Europe, the boot of Italy, and the Mediterranean is more realistic even than the first one. And then Africa is well proportioned there as well, remarkably well for the 2nd century AD. This is Asia Minor, Turkey, in other words. So you've got, let's see, this would be Milesia down here with the Milesians who provided the husbands for the 2 princesses of Zedekiah's daughters. Up here, and somewhere in here is where Troy is. This is Ionia. The Spartans, the Spartans, the Danites controlled that. There is the Dardanelles right through there, the narrow space there. Black Sea at the top, Mediterranean at the bottom. Again, that was the work of Ptolemais. This one is, I had this one figured out. Yeah, you're right, yes. This is England. I don't know, that probably is Ireland, but then you've got Denmark here, and then the Scandinavian countries there, and this is probably Norway. You can say, well, the proportions aren't quite right there, but maybe they had an earthquake since. No. But still, you know, Ptolemais shows where the peoples we would recognize as Israelites were located centuries before his time. Because he was researching and doing his drawings off of probably other maps and then putting in the labels of peoples based on the writings of historians who came before him. And if he was in the 2nd century AD, and we're in the 21st century AD, you know, see, he was way, way back there, relatively speaking. That's Spain, of course, or Iberia, and Hispania, there is what it was called when he was doing it. That was probably the Latin influence that gave it the Hispania name. Now, let's look at the time frame and the movements of the peoples. 720 BC is when, in round numbers, it was 721, when the last of the 10 tribes were being taken captive. They were taken captive over a stretch of about, 735 to 721, 14 years or so, a spread of those. Several military actions on the part of the Assyrians conquered them and deported them. So they were spread out in, actually these arrows, we had this drawn, but we got the arrows in the wrong spot. They should have gone up into here. Nineveh's right up in here. And then this arrow here that's going out into Iraq, or Iran rather, that's Iraq I guess today. It should have been up here, pointing at the bottom end of the Caspian Sea. This is a picture of a smidgen of a British Israel map. When I say British Israel now, I mean the British people who researched the history of the people going back. And they made the historical connections and established the proofs that connect themselves to the Scythians. While I was a student at Ambassador College in Bricket Wood in England, in the first 4 years of the 1970s, we had a business manager there, Francis Bergen, who's now retired, but he was a barrister, that's a corporate lawyer, before he came to college and came into the church. So he ended up, and an accountant, equivalent of a CPA or higher at the time. So he came into the church, he ended up being the business manager for many years. and was a good friend of a lot of us colonial students who he took pity on to try to give us a little culture while we were in Britain. And some of us needed some culture, so I was targeted, I guess, for that, and several others. We definitely needed some. So he said, would you like to go to a meeting of the British Israel Society? I said, really? There's a British Israel Society still? He said, yes, and I'm a member of it. Well, yeah. So he says, we got to go tonight. I have Spokesman's Club tonight, or Ambassador Club, as we call it at Ambassador. And he said, well, if you want to go, you got to go. And I said, okay. So it's the only time I skipped Ambassador Club while I was my 4 years at college was that night. And we went to London. He drove us down. We had a bite to eat, some restaurant or another. And he liked to go to the nice restaurants, and sometimes he went to Wimpy's. That was like the friend of Popeye. And that's where you bought hamburgers. They didn't make them like Americans do, but they were sort of a facsimile. But we ended up at the Royal Society, British Israel Royal Society meeting. There were about 3,000 to 3,500 people in the theater. We sat up on the balcony. And while we were sitting up there early, watching people come in and fill all the last seats, he was pointing people out. You see that man sitting at the end of that row over there? 2 rows up from the ballast, the rail that is up on the second floor. I said, yeah. He says, that's so-and-so. He's a member of parliament from the thus and such district and very famous because of his stand on this or that. He pointed out all these government officials and royals as well. I believe the royal family is a part of that, but there were other royals that were at this meeting that he identified as I didn't know who most of them were, but there they were at that meeting. And then we had a lecture, listened to a long lecture by a British Israel professor who was one of the main professors at Oxford or Cambridge. And he gave a lecture on the British Israel heritage that night. So you see, in America, we don't have that very commonly, but there is a British Israel organization in the United States, I found out later, that was quite active, in the past century at certain times. But in England, it was still considered for the high and hoity-toities of society they're a part of it. Now, again, when you realize that, then you see that there are serious people taking this seriously. It's not a fly-by-night idea that we are descended from the tribes of Israel, that the Americans are, and the British are, and various others are. And that gives then shape and form to our culture. And the prophecies about the different tribes then are telling on what we're like, or what our peoples have been like and are like, and we're going to be like until they're converted when the millennium comes. So we can track the history of the tribes based on some of that research that these kind of folks have done. So here we have the settlement of the exiles during the third captivity. What was the third captivity of the Israelites? Not the Romans. It was the house of Judah. They were taken into captivity by Babylon. And this is where the Babylonian Empire would be right down here. The Israelites were taken into the area of Nineveh, which was further north. In fact, Babylon, you had Assyria up here, this hand up here, and then you have right here, my other hand is the Babylonian Empire stretching south. Now, the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, but before that, the Assyrians had conquered Babylon. And while they were the empire, they were in charge. And then when Babylon got powerful under Nebuchadnezzar, who was the father of Nebuchadnezzar, but Nebuchadnezzar was his general, his father's general, then he conquered the Assyrians, and that was it for the Assyrians. And then they disappeared from history too, ending up showing up. And some of them migrated with Israelites, ultimately landing where they are. So there you go. You've got Babylonian captivity. That third captivity were the Jews. For the second and first captivities, meaning the 735 captivity, and then the final one about 720, 721 BC, when Samaria fell, and you took out the rest of the northern 10 tribes. So the northern 10 tribes were further north, And then the Jews, much later, about 130 years later, were taken down here. That gives you a perspective of where they were. And again, this is drawn from a British Israel Society. Let me notice this. If you can, I don't know if you can read that. You've got Elam, Babylonia there. There's Babylonia that shows it's Babylon. Right up here, where did I see the Medes? Let me look at the map down here. That's it, Mede, right up there. Thank you very much. It would be Media. They had radios, televisions. Media Empire, and then right up in here, just off of the circle, is where the Caspian Sea would be. They were at the bottom of the Caspian. The Medians and the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, and so it was the Medo-Babylonian Empire. Then they conquered the house of Judah, and the Babylonians took Judah for their own, and the Medes went off. They took part of the territory they conquered on around the Caspian, and the Babylonians kept the part that was on the European side of the Caspian Sea. So it gives you the movements of them. Median Empire was to come back again. Darius the Great was to be the first emperor of the empire of the Medes. The Medes and the Persians now. The Persians are further east. So the Medes allied with the Persians under the auspices of Darius the Great were the ones that allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. After their 70 years of captivity were over, Darius became the emperor, and the Babylonian empire was collapsed into the Medo-Persian Empire, and because of Darius, they went back home. They were allowed to, because God made him do it. And there's a prophecy about it in 2 chapters of Isaiah. You just look up Darius. You'll find in your concordance, and you'll find 2 prophecies of it in Isaiah 44 and 45, I think it is, that he would be the one to free them. Now, that was good. Then Darius wanted to make his Medo-Persian Empire bigger, so he got in a fracas with the Massagetae, M-A-S-S-A and G-E-T-A-E, Massagetae, probably derived from Manasseh and Gad. Remember that half tribe of Manasseh and Gad were close to each other. They were side by side on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So they seemed to be allied together and carrying that name as a peoples, and they were an important part of the Scythian people. They fought with Darius, and Darius died. And the way it happened went down like this. They had a queen. The queen's name was Tamiris. And if that sounds familiar, it's a variation of Tamar. A fairly common and honored name because of Tamar, who was the mother of Pharez and Zerah. And then there were a couple of other Tamars mentioned in the Bible as well. But Tamiris was the queen of the Medes and of the Massagetae, who were part of the Scythians. And Darius told her, I want to take your land. Give it to me. And she said, no, we won't give it to you. He said, well, I'll come up and take it. If you come up and take it, you'll go home drinking Persian blood. And so he made a plan to attack. They sort of feinted back and forth. And this is all written down by ancient historians, so we kind of know the battle plan. Her son was her general. Tamiris was, middle-aged. So her son was the general of her forces. So Darius sent a section of his army up with lots of supplies, especially wine, figuring that they would get captured, and then the Massagetae would get drunk, a good share of them would, and then he would attack that spot while they were drunk. And that would be the bad news for them. So the ploy worked pretty well, except that Tamiris was as smart as he was, and so she did not send everybody down to stop his wine-bearing soldiers. She held back the bulk of her army. So the wine-bearing soldiers got caught by the Massagetae, and the soldiers who caught them, then after they dispatched their enemies or tied them up, then they drank the wine and they were drunk, and then came in Darius with his Median army attacking them, thinking he had won the battle, and before he knew it, the main body of the Massagetae army came down on him in a surprise attack, which killed Darius. and pretty much destroyed the Median army. And Tamiris and the Massagetae were free, but she was furious because her son was killed. So Darius was also killed in the battle. So she filled, I think it was a goatskin full, goatskin full of Persian blood. That probably meant slaughtering a bunch of prisoners. And then she cut off Darius's head and had it stuffed in the goatskin and sent it back to the capital. Because she told him, if you come up here, and she had told him this before, he said, I want to take your land, give it to me. She said, no, and if you come up here, I will make you drink Persian blood. So that's how she fulfilled it. It's kind of a gruesome tale, but it shows the knockdown drag out that the Assyrian, or the empires of the Gentiles were having with the empire of Israel, as it was collapsing and regrouping and reorganizing and repopulating as time went by. Bear in mind, they went into captivity, the 10 tribes in 720 BC, that was finished. They were all in captivity. We've only been a nation for 227 years. Whoops. All right, yeah. Well, we'll look at it anyway. So looking at it in American time frames, it didn't take long, a couple of hundred years, and then you had a significant population of the Israelites that were in captivity or were breaking loose from captivity. They were becoming a highly populated and powerful force in different areas. Early in the Assyrian Empire's time, the Cimmerians, a big section of Cimmerians broke away. Because Syria was high, mighty, and they were very fat as an empire, and they got careless. And they let the Scythians and the Cimmerians have too much power. Cimmerians, by the way, is based on the name of Matbit-Gomerri, King Omri. So at some point they broke free and they captured Lydia. Lydia was an empire, or rather a kingdom right there in the center of Asia Minor. And then they came on across later and became known as the later Celts, became known as the Hallstatt Celts. They spread their Celtic culture all the way to France. There was already a Celtic culture there, they called it Gaul at that time. And then they came back from France a couple hundred years later and reconquered Lydia and called it Galatia. And that name stuck right into the New Testament time. This is why Paul wrote his epistle to the Galatians, because the city of Galatia was about right in there someplace, and the region around it was the nation of Galatia, which was now a Roman province by the time of Paul. But that's because some of the Celts came back to reconquer what was once their homeland and to end up then getting afoul of the Romans and that kind of thing. We have, quickly here, we have, whoops, the wrong thing. Just a second. There we are. Scythians are moving up between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They're also known as the Sakasini here. Over here, you have the Massagetae, with no Saka there, but look at this. Instead of Scythians on the east side, they're called the Saka. That is the same word. It's the Persian language, though. The Saka, the Scythians, and the Cimmerians, all the same peoples, the 10 tribes of Israel. And I don't know if I have that on this presentation. Whoops, we'll go back. Oh, no, I want that one back there. I'll talk about those in a minute. Here we have the Assyrians and the Medes. They're a little bit far north, but this is one of the British Israel drawings. Scotland, Scythian becomes Scotland when you put in another vowel. It's the sk name. Scandinavia is a Scythian name. Any of the SK or SC names where we believe there are Israelites today are based on Scythia. Some were based on the Cimmerians. The Welsh call themselves today the Cimbri, which is derived from Cimmeria, which is derived from Matbit-Gomerri. The Gomerri part of the land of the house of Omri was Gomerri. There's another way of identifying that well, maybe it's in here. If it's not in here, ask me about the Behiston rock when I get done. Let's look at some of the Scythian art. Again, a little bit more that gives us some indication of the Scythian capabilities before we talk about, here we are. They're hunting lions, that's a lion. Horses, this guy's shooting his bow into the lion, shooting an arrow. Notice the length of the bow, about the length of a horse's neck. It's about 1 meter for a war horse. Over here, this one appears to have a lance or a spear that he's trying to drive in, and they have dogs helping them. Trousers, boots, he lost his hat. This one has his hat. Trousers, boots, and it looks like almost like a stirrup there. I don't know that they had invented stirrups. I'm not sure what that is. This is a Scythian warrior or soldier stringing his bow. If you know anything about archery, this is a double recurved, very complex bow made of a wood core with sometimes reinforced with bone in certain places, covered with sinew, a lot of sinew, and then sealed up in a waterproof container, a hide. Herodotus, did I tell you this? How Herodotus told you how the Scythians became good warriors? Maybe I didn't. Herodotus visited a Scythian encampment along the Black Sea, on the Russian side of the Black Sea, for 2 years when he was writing. He was a Greek historian. He lived there. We lived with the Scythians, so he had a lot of time with them. And he described how a Scythian warrior became a warrior. He had to ride, it was mounted archery. He'd be riding at full tilt and fire his bow at a target that was 60 bow lengths away, and based on the average length of what we saw lined up against a horse's neck, I would say that would be about 60 meters, 65 yards, and he had to hit the bullseye 3 times at full gallop in order to qualify to become a warrior for a young man. However, the other kicker, and this is the hard part, before his first arrow hit the target, the third arrow had to be in the air. And their bows were 150 to 200 pound bows. Boom, 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 like that. It's amazing how they could do that, but that's what Herodotus recorded as far as the test to make sure that you're of the warrior class and you could be fielded in the mounted cavalry. So it gives you some idea. You know, later we ended up with the English and their longbow. They had a longbow because that was what was easy to make a bow out of back in England days, but they had to make the composite bows, and that changed warfare. It gave them a great edge because they were very powerful. It was a Scythian, a Parthian. The Parthians was an empire that started in the 200s BC, lasted until 226 AD. Almost 500 years, it was a Scythian empire. It covered Iran and Iraq. That was the territory of Parthia. They fought battles with Rome, and neither one could best the other, except one time. That was a legion, the legions of Ptolemy, who was an associate of Caesar, decided to conquer Parthia while what's-his-name was down conquering Egypt, mainly by conquering Cleopatra, Mark Antony, and Caesar was busy over by Italy. So he came up against the Scythians. And the way they fought the Romans, because the Romans did a turtle. They had these big shields that were about 4 feet high, 18 or so inches wide, and they were designed when they went into battle, they'd throw up a shield wall. All armies did that. But what the Romans would do is they were very good at it, and they had bigger shields. So they would also put a shield roof, because the next lines of the troops in the square would throw their shields up high and hold them. So if they tried to fire arrows down on the soldiers, they were knocked off by the shields. It's remarkable. The Scythians ran against that, and they figured out a tactic. They galloped in where they were within javelin distance, because the soldiers on the second and third rows were carrying javelins to throw at the enemy that was coming in, charging in. So they would drop the shields to throw the javelins, and as the shields went down, zip, 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 zip went the arrows, and took out the whole front end of that side of the Romans. And the Romans would go back to the turtle, as they called it, the shields back up, and the Scythians would gallop away. And then the second time around, the Romans weren't going to do that. They're going to wait till they got closer. So in order to entice them to drop the shields, they would gallop in and mill around as if they were in confusion, and the Romans were sure they could get to them with the javelins, and they would drop the shields, and the Parthians would fire as they were kicking their horses in the ribs and galloping away, and they shot back over the shoulder like that, which is called what? The Parthian shot, which we get the parting shot from, but it was from the Parthian shot. And that's how they wiped out his entire army, Ptolemy's army. I think that was 53 BC. They were very powerful. Scythians, some of them before Parthia, this one was, whoops, sorry. There we go. This is Greek art. They had Scythians who served as policemen in Athens. Well, if the Athens had not been taken over primarily by Gentiles by that time, then it was partly Israelite too. It makes more sense. You would have a force of Scythians being your policemen. And so they carried their bows, and people behaved themselves if they were within bowshot, which was a pretty good bet they would be within bowshot. In 300 BC, by this time, this is where everything, from 720, now almost 400 years later, we have this kind of a spread. Alexander has established his empire. Out here to the east, you have the Saka have moved further away from the Caspian Sea, out into Central Asia, along the Silk Road, warring as they went. The Scythians have moved north into Russia. The Cimmerians had moved out of, let me see, where am I? Asia Minor. Yeah, there we go. They're out of Asia Minor, and they moved up into Central Europe, establishing that later, what would be the later Celtic culture, the Hallstatt Celt culture that was deemed to be about 450 BC, but it would have been to some degree. You have the other Celts and Gauls over here, England and in France, that part of Europe. And probably, no, not quite yet. They hadn't moved, Asgard hadn't sent his people north. So we march on as the time frame goes. We have the migration of Israel from captivity. This is a very interesting map. In the handout that we'll put together, actually I have a copy of this map that was drawn by some British, a couple of ministers of the Anglican church years ago, in the 1800s. Based on the history they'd put together by that time. So we have Media here at the south end of the Caspian, the Massagetae, that's what that word says there. You have the Scythians, who were the Saka and the Scythians were the same. We'll get to that in a minute. They migrated ultimately up and into Scythia in that part of Europe. You have the Sakai coming up between the Black and Caspian Sea, that's Scythians as well. Galatia, where the Celts came back and took their kingdom of Lydia and made Galatia. Again, that time the name stuck. Later on, they marched on and went back into Europe. You have Gallia here, Celtic Iberia, so we have a Celtic population here, the Danite settlements up in here. So this is a very interesting map for you to study where the movements were. It isn't timed. It's spread out over all the migrations at various times so that you get sort of a composite picture. This is just a picture of England and Gaul, rather, France, and the various Celtic tribes are here. Now, one of the things that we look for in studying the tribes in tribe tracking is we look for tribes and their tribal names, and we compare them to the sons and the grandsons of the 12 brothers of Joseph, the 11 brothers of Joseph, to their names. They would have sons and grandsons, each of those tribal patriarchs. So you look at the names of their sons and grandsons, and often you will find then a clan that is a tribal size of its own. By this time, would be over in the various parts of Europe. So that's one of the other clues. Some of the names are for other reasons, but when you find ones that are related to the names of the sons and grandsons of the 12 patriarchs of Israel. There's Celtic Britain. In the 1st century BC, it was going to be conquered by the Romans in the 1st century AD. But at this time, it is a Celtic land, well populated with the Celts. This is 400 years before the Angles and Saxons invade and establish the English. And with the Angles and Saxons, you had Ephraim and Manasseh both coming in, because Manasseh was going to go on. You also had then another infusion of one of the tribes from across over in, let me see, France would be right down in here. Let me see, the French one was, the name is escaping me at the moment. Yeah. William the Conqueror, 1066, won the Battle of Hastings. He brought with him the Normans, who were the tribe of Benjamin. So we believe that the tribe of Benjamin was infused, maybe 8 to 10% of the British population was Benjamin. But bear in mind that Joseph and Benjamin were brothers, but that was how you got a lot of it infused, by William the Conqueror bringing his friends from Normandy over there. Norman was the Northman, basically was the name of that. Okay, pressing on. 150 BC, we have the movements of the Saka, what was left of them coming back from fighting with the Chinese. They were known as the Yuchi was the name of the Massagete. They went over and fought with the Chinese for about 200 or 300 years. It wasn't any fun when they started building a wall, so they came back down the Silk Road, and then they settled in next to the Parthian Empire. Parthia would be an empire for another 100 years. You have the Alans moving in, and you think, where do the Alans come from? What are the last two syllables of Zebulun? Alan. Elon or Alon. So you've got the basis for the Alans. The Roxolani, the various, they would put an I on the end. The ending was a Roman when you put an I on it. There's the Roxolani there. The Gauls are spread out throughout Europe. Rome is a republic at this time, not the empire. The Guttones have moved up into Scandinavia. It's beginning to be settled. The Parthians had Scythian origins, rose to power with the aid of the Massagetae. They were an arch rival to Rome, mounted archers. That's a classic Parthian carving there. They defeated, I already told you, Roman general Crassus. I said it was Crassus in 53 BC. The empire lasted from 250 BC to 226 AD. How many of you read about the Parthians when you study history in school? How many of you, oh, we have a few. How many of you read about Rome when you were studying in school? Yeah, see? But they didn't write very much about the Parthians at all. We looked at a history book my daughter had when she was taking history major at the University of Oregon. I think they had a paragraph about the Parthian Empire in a world history book. That was it. But they held Rome off 500 years. They were dominant in their territory. The Parthian shot I already talked about. There's an illustration of it. 150 AD, the Parthian Empire is still alive and strong. Rome is a lot bigger. It's now bordering Parthia. You have the Saka up here moving down in, the Alans moving, coming up into the Europe as well, the Roxolani, Goths, Gauls, Celts, and Teutons. So they're starting to consolidate into northwestern Europe. In 300 AD, the Parthians are gone. They were conquered not by Rome. The Parthians had conquered the Persians to take over. So then they ruled the Persians. But they had the Battle of Nisibis it was this location in eastern or western Parthia. With the Romans, it was a 3-day hand-to-hand combat, non-stop battle. When normally the hand-to-hand combat, when you got the two armies together, the war was getting them there, and then you had a day of fighting and somebody won. They fought for 3 days, and then they fell back because neither one could best the other. The Romans went home, the Parthians stayed where they were, but they had lost, as the French had at Agincourt, they lost a great deal of their leadership and nobility in that battle. Then the Persians rose up and rebelled and took over, at which time the Parthian peoples began to migrate out of the Middle East and began the journey like others had before them, up around the Black Sea and down into Europe. In the 500s, we have the various groups sweeping in back and forth. The Vandals come sweeping down here. They cross over. They tore up everything down through there. And then they decided to go to Carthage, and then they settled down. Carthage had been one of the Phoenician ports here. They settled there, and they had an empire that covered that whole section of northern Europe for about 80 years. That was the breadbasket of Rome, even at that time. Rome didn't have enough room to grow enough wheat to feed its people, so it had to use North Africa as its breadbasket. Finally, they conquered them, and they disappeared. They left. Showed up someplace else. You know, they said the people didn't die. They took their casualties. You had the Visigoths coming through, the Ostrogoths. The Visigoths are the Eastern Goths. They came through first. Then the Ostrogoths are the Western Goths. They came through second. The Goths were simply the Scythians under another name, ultimately settling out into the national locations that they would be a part of. But God was sifting them. He said he would sift Israel like sand through a sieve. And so he did. Anglo-Saxon warrior, tribal national traits. This is how we look at them. Reuben, a son. Reuben, though, is unstable as water. Simeon means to hear. It was Wales and scattered. Reuben, of course, was France. Levi was attached to the various tribes, mostly to the Jews. The Kohans is the Hebrew for priest. Judah were the Jews. Dan were Ireland, Denmark, and in the USA. You know, America has probably more Danites than in either Denmark or Ireland, and has for a long time. Naphtali, Norway or Sweden, Scandinavian in other words. Gad, Sweden or Switzerland. Strong donkey crouched down. No, let's see, the Gad was a troop. We use the thinking of a troop that there were Swiss guards guarding the Pope, and that Gad was a troop. But the other prophecy for Switzerland is what Asher is. Let's see, where's that? Where did I have that? Issachar, like a strong donkey crouched between two burdens. Issachar is that. And so we placed Finland in that because on the one side they had the Russians, on the other side they had their warlike Viking neighbors, their brothers, as it were, but still warlike. But Switzerland was in a similar position. He had Assyria to the north, because that's where the Assyrians moved, was to Central Europe, and to the south they had Rome, strong donkey between two burdens. So in a few cases it's hard to pin down where the bulk of the tribes are. We know that they're sown throughout. We do know that the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh is fairly easy to identify. Manasseh's cultural traits. This is quite interesting. It means to make forgetful. Why did Joseph name him Manasseh? Anybody remember? I have gotten a son. Now I can forget my loss of my family back home. I have a family now, so I can forget. Forgetful. Forgetful in America is. We forget differences quickly. Now, probably in the South, the Rebs would argue with that. You know, the people who still fight in their minds the Civil War. But really, they've forgotten the Civil War too, because there have been other things that have come on. America can forget differences and become friends or allies with other countries. One of the strengths the country has had. Isaac means laughter, a sense of fair play. And of course, that's going to be filtered through all the tribes, but it certainly would be filtered through Manasseh. Manasseh comes from the root noshe. Noshe means movement from its proper place. Remember when Jacob was wrestling with this mysterious, super strong person, we believe to be Jesus Christ manifesting himself before his human birth to wrestle him that one night. Wrestled all night long, and finally he pushed a nerve out of its joint, the sciatic nerve out of its place, and so Jacob wouldn't let go, even with the pain. And it was getting to be morning, and he said, "Let me go, because the morning's coming." He says, "I won't go unless you bless me." So, or let go, and so he was given a blessing. That was, they call that the noshe, that particular nerve in Hebrew today. Movements from its proper place. The word for woman is noshim. One of the words for woman is noshim. And the argument here, the presentation, this is done by an Israeli historian who's come up with this explanation, who believes in the identity of the tribes. A woman pushes the legal identity over to her husband as they marry. But he is then in debt to her. She's the creditor. I'm giving you my name to be joined with yours, but you have to provide responsible representation for me. It's a two-way street. It sometimes isn't thought of, but it is a two-way street. Therefore, to be known as Manasseh, the Manasseh part, the Neshe or Noshe, the last part of Manasseh, it could be drawn to represent the delegated representation of the U.S. government. It's a little complex, but it's not really that complex. Yardavidi, again, the Israeli historian who studies these things, shows that. Now, quickly, Matthew 19, Christ tells the Son of Man will sit on the throne you have followed me, will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. The tribes are intact, and they will be intact in the world tomorrow, and the original apostles will be the spirit kings over those tribes. And by Christ's prophecy, right there in Matthew 19. Paul, and I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. What fathers? The tribal fathers. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then the 12 tribes underneath. Earnestly serving God day and night, and hope to attain. And so he draws this in talking to King Agrippa. You can read the context later in Acts 26. Paul's countrymen, this is in Romans. If you want to know, did Paul given up on Israel? Not by any means. Just read Romans chapter 9. I tell the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience also bearing me witness in the Holy Spirit. 3 affirmations that I have a great sorrow and continual grief in my heart, because I could wish that I could be accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen, according to the flesh. He loved his people. Even he was a Benjamite, we know that. But he knew who the other tribes were. And that was Paul's statement of it. So to say that it is unimportant to understand the background of the tribes, then you can't understand what Paul is saying so powerfully and so passionately right there in Romans. It is important to understand who the tribes are to get a full picture of God's way of life. Why track the tribes? Paul refers to the tribes who are Israelites, to whom pertain the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the service of God, the promises, of whom are the fathers, from whom, according to the flesh, Christ came, who is over all, the eternally blessed God. Amen. To understand the tribes, the existence of the tribes, lost, and the ones the Jews really never were lost, they were understood who they were, but he's referring to the other tribes too. You can see the importance the apostles put on understanding who the lost 10 tribes were to fit in with the ones that weren't lost. Brethren, my heart's desire, Paul continues in chapter 10, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved, for there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is rich to all who call upon him. Whoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, whether they're Jewish, tribe of Judah, or the 10 tribes who were lost, or the Gentiles. Doesn't matter. They're God's children. Every last one. Are the tribes cast away? Paul says, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. And Benjamin was one of the 10 tribes, although he wasn't as lost because he was largely folded in with Judah, but not entirely. Now, the passion of the Apostle Paul, I think, is indicative of the fact that we need to have a passion for God's people too, wherever they are. And no, we have the expanded understanding. Well, Paul understood it just as well. I mean, he was the apostle to the Gentiles, wasn't he? And he's talking like this about the Israelites. So you see, we have to have a great love for all peoples and understand that they had great pasts and passionate identities of the past. They have history. And they have many, many relatives long dead in the grave, and they will all be brought out of their graves. To understand the lost 10 tribes is to understand and value the history of mankind and the fact that God is going to bring those sons and daughters to glory as well when he brings them out in the great white throne judgment, which is pictured by the last great day. Tribe tracking is a mystery. For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and so Israel will be saved. There's a spiritual blindness to the tribes of Israel, to the Jews, and all the rest of the tribes that he's talking about in those 3 chapters, Romans 9, 10, and 11, but all Israel will be saved. Likewise, all the Gentiles will be saved in the sense of be given that opportunity. Speaking of the Gentiles about Israelites, concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but concerning the election as being chosen for God for a special use, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. They are descendants of the great patriarchs of old. Paul did not devalue the understanding of who the lost 10 tribes were, any more than he devalued the understanding of who the Jews were or the Gentiles. James, a bondservant of God to the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. James knew where they were. The Apostle John in Revelation, the holy city, New Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. She has a great high wall, 12 gates, 12 angels at the gates, and the names written on the gates are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. They will be immortalized, I guess you could say, on the name tags of the gates at that time. Tribe tracking into the future is what we look forward to in the kingdom of God. But having this historical understanding helps us grasp the significance of what God has called us to do. You can't divorce yourself from the people who lived in the past. You need to know who they were. We need to know that there were Israelites, ancestors of the tribes that many of us are part of. And that there were ancestors of all the Gentile tribes too. And they will all have their opportunity in the kingdom of God. But God did give Israel responsibility to be a shining example, which sometimes they were, but often they were not. He's giving us a greater example in the church of God from all backwards and walks of life to ultimately teach that wonderful gospel of God's kingdom to our physical ancestors as well as to everybody else. So again, I think that understanding the identity of the tribes of Israel and valuing it highly, you can see God's hand in history, and you can see the hand that he is giving us in the future, which will eventually be history when we are bringing all those sons and daughters to glory, as in converting them, ultimately helping to resurrect them into the kingdom of God. Okay, that concludes the presentation. I think you've gotten an earful today. So, thank you. If you have any questions, you can just come and ask.